Welcome to EduRev.
Hello everyone, welcome to EduRev. This is Saranandula. In the previous video, we have discussed about the Trans-Himalayas. Now, in this video, we will be discussing the Eastern Hills or the Purvanchal. Now, previously we have learnt that the entire Himalayan region can be divided into three parts. First one is the Himalayan ranges, second the Trans-Himalayas, and the third one is Eastern Hills or Purvanchal. So in the previous video, we were done with Trans-Himalayas. Now, let us try to understand the Eastern Hills. Clear? Now, let us just go through this para once and then we'll try to understand the meaning of this. After crossing the Dihang Gorge, so Dihang means Brahmaputra. The other name for Brahmaputra river is Dihang. So after crossing the Dihang Gorge, now what do you mean by gorge? Gorge is nothing but a very steep valley which is formed by a river. So when we say Dihang Gorge, that is nothing but a gorge or a very steep valley which was formed by river Dihang or simply Brahmaputra. So after crossing the Dihang Gorge, which is in Assam, the Himalayas take a southward turn. We call it as syntaxial bend, and they form a series of low hills running in the shape of a crescent. And all these hills together are called the Eastern Hills or Purvanchal. So the Himalayas, they cross the Dihang Gorge. So just imagine this gap to be the Dihang Gorge. After crossing the Dihang Gorge, they take a southward bend. So this southward bend is called syntaxial bend. Okay. And then they form a chain of low hills. So these low hills are Purvanchal or Eastern Hills, as simple as that. So let me just repeat this one more time. The Himalayas, after they cross the Dihang Gorge, which is in Assam, they take a southward bend. So this southward bend is called syntaxial bend. Clear? They take a southward bend and they run southwards. They form a chain of low hills, which are nothing but the Eastern Hills or Purvanchal. Clear, right? Now, let me just show you the map for the sake of clarity. So, the Great Himalayan Range, and this is the Dihang Gorge. Okay, so now they have taken a southern bend here, a southward bend. So, this is the syntaxial bend which I was talking about. Now, here you have something called Patkai Boom range, and then you have the Naga Hill range, and Manipur Hill range, and Mizo Hill range. And to the west, you also have the hills of Garo, Khasi, and Jaintia. So all these belong to the Eastern Hills or Purvanchal. Okay, let us just go through the map one more time for the sake of clarity. The Great Himalayas, they have crossed the Dihang Gorge in Assam, formed by the river Dihang or Brahmaputra. And now they have taken a syntaxial bend southwards. And now they have formed a chain of low hills. So you have Patkai Boom, next you have Naga Hills, and you have Manipur Hills, Mizo Hills, and in the west you have the hills of Garo, Khasi, and Jaintia in the state of Meghalaya. So all these hills, they belong to the Eastern Hills or Purvanchal. As simple as that. Now, extending from Arunachal Pradesh in the north to Mizoram in the south, they form India's boundary with Myanmar. So now let us go back to map. Extending from Arunachal Pradesh in the north to Mizoram in the south, these hills, they form a natural boundary between India and Myanmar. Clear, right? Now, these hills are very different from Himalayas in terms of scale. What do you mean by scale? In terms of size, these hills are very different from that of Himalayas. These hills are a chain of low hills. Okay, if you just look at those hills, they don't resemble Himalayas in any way. So in terms of scale, these are very different from Himalayas. But this point is very important. They are formed from the same orogeny. Now, what do you mean by the word orogeny? In geology, orogeny means mountain building event. Clear? So what is the meaning of this? Now the collision between Indian plate and the Eurasian plate, That event is the orogeny, which led to the formation of Himalayas. Now, even though the eastern hills, they look completely different from the Himalayas, they are formed from the same event. That is the collision between Indian plate and the Eurasian plate. So, these hills are very different from the Himalayas in terms of scale, but they are formed from the same orogeny. And what is that orogeny? Collision of Indian plate and Eurasian plate, which led to the formation of the other Himalayas. Clear? So that is the reason we are including the eastern hills as part of the Himalayan range. Now, in the north is the Patkai Bum range, which forms the international boundary between Arunachal Pradesh and Myanmar. So the hills of this range rise to an elevation between 2000 meter to 3000 meter. After running some distance southwards, Patkai Bum merges into Naga Hills, okay, which forms the international boundary between India and Myanmar. Clear? Now, to the south of Naga Hills, we have the Manipur Hills, whose elevation is less than 2500 meter, and they form the international boundary between Manipur and Myanmar. Clear, right? So here Naga Hills form the international boundary between Nagaland and Myanmar. To the south of that, you have Manipur Hills, whose elevation is less than 2500 meter. So these hills form the international boundary between Manipur and Myanmar. Now, on the west, you have the hills of Jaintia, Khasi, and Garo, which are in Meghalaya. So this is an image of Khasi Hills. It's very, very beautiful, right? Covered with thick forests. Now, to the south of Manipur Hills, you have the Mizo Hills. So Mizo Hills are also called Lushai Hills, whose elevation is less than 1500 meter. Now let us just go through this one more time for the sake of clarity. In the north, you have the Patkai Bum range. Okay, so just imagine this as the Patkai Bum range. Now, the Patkai Bum merges into the Naga Hills. Okay, so this is Patkai Bum and this is Naga Hills. Now, the continuation of Naga Hills is Manipur Hills and Mizoram Hills. Okay, and to the west you have the hills of Khasi, Garo and Jaintia in Meghalaya. Clear, right? Now, the Patkai Bum Hills, they form the international boundary between Arunachal Pradesh and Myanmar. The Naga Hills, they form the international boundary between Nagaland and Myanmar. Next, you have Manipur Hills and Mizoram Hills, which perform the same function. They are acting as the international boundary between Manipur, Myanmar, Mizoram, and Myanmar. And to the west, you have the hills of Khasi, Garo, and Jaintia in Meghalaya. So basically, all these hills together are called the Eastern Hills or the Purvanchal, as simple as that. Now, let us just go through the map one more time for the sake of clarity. So this is the Dihang Gorge in Assam, and the Himalayas have taken a southward bend. We call them as the syntaxial bend. So a bend like this is syntaxial bend. So first you have the Patkai Bum range, and Patkai Bum range eventually merges into the Naga Hills, and to the south of Naga Hills you have the Manipur Hills and Mizo Hills, and to the west you have the hills of Garo, Khasi and Jaintia. Clear, right? So guys, I'm hoping that you got a clear picture now. So as we have observed, the elevation of the eastern hills decreases as we move from north to south. Okay, so elevation of the hills decreases as we move from north to south. Now, what is the elevation of the hills of Patkai Bum? Somewhere between 2000 meter to 3000 meter. Now, what is the elevation of Mizo Hills? It is less than 1500 meter. So as we move from north to south, the elevation of the hills decreases. So this is one important point you need to keep in mind. Clear? Now, although these hills are low, they are very difficult to cross over because of the rough terrain and dense forests. So with this, we are done with the concept of the eastern hills or Purvanchal. So basically, in eastern hills, you have the ranges of Patkai Bum. Next, you have Naga range, Manipur range, Mizo range, and to the west, you have the hills of Khasi, Garo, Jaintia in Meghalaya. So all these hills together are nothing but eastern hills. So even though these hills are low, and even though these hills do not resemble Himalayas in any way, they are the result of the same orogeny, which is nothing but the collision of Indian plate and Eurasian plate. So with this, we are done with the concept of eastern hills. So guys, I hope you found this video useful and informative. Thank you so much for watching, and I wish you all the best.